Baking, margins and LODs. Now what is baking? Simply said, baking is copying a texture to another texture or even to itself. That is done with help of the UV map. A model can have more than one UV map. So let's have a look at that. When you go to the Object Data tab here in the Properties panel, you can find the UV section here. Let's open it up. And here you see one UV map. That's the one we made when making creases and unwrapping. We can copy this by hitting the plus sign here. It'll just make an exact copy of the first one. Let's have a look at that in the UV editing layout. Here you can see the UV map. And now let's select one of these islands here. So click on it and rotate it. It doesn't matter in what angle. Go to the UV maps here again in the Object Data tab. We have the second one selected. And when we go to the first one again, you can see that we have the original map again. So we have two maps. Now what can we do with this? We can bake a new texture or change the original texture with help of the UV maps. So the position of this triangle in the texture will get the position or rotation of the same triangle of the new UV map. It's a little bit difficult and hard to grasp, but don't worry, we will not yet bake to another texture. We'll first bake to the same UV map. So we'll delete the second UV map. Let's go to the texture paint layout. And first we're going to bake to the same texture, and we did it because if you remember when we went to a lower resolution, our edges went black. Let's have a look at that again. So let's go to Preferences in the Edit menu, Preferences, and then go to Viewport. And here on the textures, we limited the size to 128. Now the model looks blurred, and that's because we have the interpolation set wrong. So we go to the Materials tab, and then here on the interpolation mode, we set it from linear to closest. Now the textures are sharp, but we have some problems with the edges. Some of them turn dark or black. Let's analyze it on the texture to see what's happening. Let's zoom in on this part and turn on Display Texture Paint UVs on the view. This makes the UVs visible. Now have a look at this texture here. You can see that it's very close to the edge of the UV. And when you have your texture on a low resolution, you will see that some pixels of the background will spill into the UVs. So what we'll do is we'll go into the render properties here. We have the output properties below that. We used that before. But in the render options we have the render engine set to Eevee, and that's the default render engine in Blender 2.8 and up. We also have a Cycles render engine, and Cycles is a ray traced render engine. If you want to know what that is, maybe you better look it up on Wikipedia or something, because that's a lot to talk about and that's beyond this course. So let's put it on Cycles, because in Cycles we have a bake option here. As you can see in Eevee, we're still missing that. Maybe it'll come in the future, but we don't really need that. We can just switch to Cycles and use that bake option because it does what we need. So let's open the bake option here and have a look at what we're looking at. We have the bake button here. Let's not hit that yet, but let's have a look at the bake type. It's on combine now, and as the word says, it will bake a combined texture of everything. So the light that shines on the model and the shadows it creates, it will all be in the texture bake then. You can also bake a shadow map. That's something you use a lot in game engines, for example, because you don't want to recalculate the shadows in real time. You just bake the shadows in a texture and then project that on your model. So you can choose them all here: a shadow map, a normal map, let me see, a diffuse map, here diffuse, and also emit. The model is still on emission, so let's go to shading. Here it's on emission. Let's first go to texture paint again. Now I don't want to bake out the emission, I want to bake the diffuse color. So instead of using the emission out, let's use the BSDF out and put it into the material output. So color out from texture to the input of the BSDF, and then out at BSDF into the material output again. Back to the texture paint tab, and then here on the bake, we have a bake type that's called diffuse. Now we have three options here: direct, indirect and color. Direct light is light shining directly on the model, so from the sun or a lamp for example. Indirect is reflected from the floor, anything surrounding the object, or reflecting light from itself. But the only thing we want to render out now or bake out is color. So we only want the color we painted in that's on the model now to be baked. So we can do that by turning the other two off, so they grayed out, and the blue one is the one that's on, and that's color. Now margin will help us get rid of these dark edges. What that will do it will, let's make this a little bit bigger, it will smear the colors on the edges out to the side. So here it will go to the left, like so. And here it will smear the color out to the bottom. So always outward from the UV map or the existing texture. Now if it doesn't make sense, no problem, because we'll do it right away now. It's pretty hard to understand and pretty hard to explain for me, so we'll just start. Now clear image here, we can turn it either on or off. In this case it doesn't really matter. When it's on, it will clear the image first and then bake. When it's off, it will do pretty much the same thing now. It will only make a difference when you bake only parts of the UVs. By default, the margin is set on 16 pixels. This will add 16 pixels from the edge of the UVs. We can set this on 32. That will cause an overlap from islands that are close to each other, but it doesn't matter because Blender does a perfect job keeping those separated. There's another option, selected to active. You can forget about it now. That's just used for baking from one model to another. Okay, we are on diffuse here. Make sure that only color is highlighted. Set the margin on 32. Clear image can be either on or off. Make sure that selected to active is turned off. Make sure that in the nodes here on the shading, the texture output goes to the BSDF input. Then the BSDF output goes to the material output. So we don't use emission. Back to texture paint. Let's hit bake. We will see an error message here. Let's just try it. Let's hit bake. And it says no valid selected objects. And that's because we didn't select the well yet. We haven't selected the model at all. So let's go to object mode and then select the object. Select the well. Like so. And then go back to paint mode. Or texture paint. And hit bake. We do get another error. It says circular dependency for image, blah 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 blah. And that's because we are baking on the same texture as we are using. So it's circular in a way. It's more of a warning than an error. So we can ignore that. Look at the texture. The margin is created. It overlaps here, but you see it just stops right in the middle. So Blender did a really good job. The edge on the model is gone. So it did exactly what we wanted. Now when you zoom in, you can see that it does blur the pixels. But that's not a problem. What it does, it takes a pixel here and just smears it out to the outside. That's how it's working. And that's solving a problem. So now we can save our texture. Let's do save as, so we can save the old one as well if you want. For some reason Blender gives me these small windows. That's not a problem. We'll just make them bigger. Let's hit the plus sign, so we are at 9 now. I already was at 9 I see, but it probably has something to do with the fact that I'm recording this tutorial and make mistakes with my numbering. Doesn't matter, let's just save it as 9 and keep it like that. Another thing we can do is make LODs. You can see this texture has a lower resolution than we used to have. A little bit like Minecraft or 8-bit, 16-bit, name it whatever you want. But the texture isn't like this, so if you save this out for a game engine, then it will just be the same as when in the preferences I turn the limit size off. The resolution is high again. And that's what the texture looks like. Now if you want to have a low res texture, we can bake that from the high res texture. So make sure that in the preferences on the viewport, in the texture section, turn off the limit size, so it doesn't limit the texture to any resolution lower than it really is. So what do we need when we want to bake this high res texture into a low res texture? We first need to have a low res image. So let's make that first. Let's first take this high res image out of the image editor texture slot by clicking on the cross or the X. Now we have an empty image editor, so I'll make a new texture. Let's give it a name. Let's call it T for texture underscore well, LR for low resolution, and low resolution means, well, less pixels than high resolution. HR would mean high res, so more pixels. Let's call it underscore BC for base color again, and come to think of that, let's make that instead of LR, let's make that 128. That way we'll always know what resolution the texture has. So type in 128 for width and height. You can turn alpha off, we don't need that. And hit OK. So now we have a very tiny texture here. So let's bake this texture on that texture. So let's go to shading. And let's have a look at the nodes here. Let's make this a little bit bigger. So if you want to bake something to a texture, you need a texture selected. So if there's just one texture, it'll take the texture that's there. but you can add another texture, select it, and then it'll bake to that texture. So let's hit Shift A and add a texture. So here texture, image texture. Now zoom in a bit. We can see what we're doing. So here we can choose our new texture, the 128 version. So load it into this slot and keep this selected. So now it's selected, now it's not. Select it by clicking on it. Now let's go back to shading. And what we will see is a black texture. And there's nothing to be afraid of. That's because we have the other texture selected now and there's nothing in there yet. If you select the original texture, we'll get the base color back again. But that's not what we need, so let's select the 128 version again, go back to texture paint, and let's hit bake. And what happens? We get a very blurred texture. But that makes sense. When you look at the texture, you see it's not interpolated, it's very sharp. So the texture is okay, but it's just painted wrong or projected wrong on the model. And to fix that, let's go to the shader tab. And then have a look at the 128 texture. It is on linear and it needs to be on closest. Let's go back to our texture paint tab and have a look at the model. It's nice and sharp. But we can't render it out like this yet because we are still using the high resolution texture. So for rendering out the low resolution texture, we can place it below the high resolution texture and connect color to the input of the BSDF node. Let's render it. Oh, and before I forget, let's not render it. Let's first put it on the right render engine because we are still on cycles. So let's put it on Eevee. Eevee? Now you can hit either F12 or choose render and render image. And we use the non-emissive shader and that makes it a bit dark. So let's turn it on the emissive shader and try again. So let's connect the output of the low-res texture to the emissive shader's input and the emissive shader's output to the material output node. Now let's try and render again. Render and render image. And there you have it. A nice and crispy looking model with a low resolution texture. If you want, you can save this image. I won't do it now, but save or save as. Let's make sure we set everything back to normal. So we need the high-res image for the rest of this course. So we can leave this low-res image here, but we'll reconnect the high-res image to the emission shader again. So let's go from color to emission shader, and from emission shader we are going to the material shader. Now let's disconnect the low-res image. Just click on the input and drag it out of it. And let's make sure that if you want, save the low-res texture. Let's go to texture paint first, and here this is our low-res image. And as you can see, there's a star next to it, so let's go to image and save as, or save as. We didn't save it yet, so let's do save as. And the name is correct, so let's just hit save as image. So the low-res image can be used for a game with a style like that, but it can also be used for a high-res game with LODs. And LOD stands for level of detail, and that is something that game engines use, that when you're further away it uses low resolution images instead of loading in the high resolution images. And that's because then we are again cheaper. You can also do it with models, so that when the model is further away you have less topology. We will not use that here at this moment because we're not learning things about game engines, but we are learning making art in Blender. So maybe that's something for another course. Now let's also make sure that our high-res image is saved. There's no star next to it, so it is saved in this case, but make sure it is. Let's also save our project. So go to File and do a save. Or just type in Ctrl S. That's it for this lecture. I will now show you the low-res and high-res image next to each other. And then we'll go on to the next lecture. I hope you enjoyed this one. Okay, enough talking. Let's go and see the textures. And see you in the next lecture. Bye bye.